NieR Automata is one of the games that I've played recently, and for me it already has one of the greatest soundtracks out of every game that I've ever played. There were many things that made me wanna play NieR Automata, and I've heard from many people to say that the soundtrack of this game is quite significant and one of the best that you can find in modern gaming, which obviously at first it felt like a stretch. It seemed to be another soundtrack that would emphasize into this more cinematic and modern classical approach that we've seen this basically trending with many recent gaming titles. But in the case of NieR Automata, I saw the hype. I'm not gonna be a contrarian in this case. I truly believe that this is one of the most significant soundtracks out of any modern game that you can find. So much so that I would say that if you're a modern classical composer or if you're planning to compose a video game soundtrack, this is one of those that you should probably take notes of and listen to it, because there are many aspects that make the soundtrack really exceptional on what it does. It follows some certain tropes, but in some of its approaches it ends up being quite unique and exceptional. So it comes to the point where I basically decided that I'm gonna make a tier list ranking all of the tracks out of the soundtrack of NieR Automata. Now in this tier list I'm basically gonna contain every single one of the tracks that are contained in the NieR Automata OST, which you can find on streaming services and also on the physical releases. But the way I'm gonna approach the ranking out of those tracks is not necessarily gonna be that much with having the tracks in mind as part of the OST, because in these cases you only have some certain portions that are being played out of those tracks, and also in a pacing that doesn't do all that much of a justice to the song themselves. So I'm gonna rank them more based on my experience out of playing the game and listening to the soundtrack in game, because you have many moments throughout the game where the tracks go into many different phases. There is not just one particular pattern, you have many layers throughout the soundtracks, and in certain portions throughout the story you have moments with additional or more minimal instrumentation. You have other moments that are just instrumental, or other occasions where there are vocals included. And because of all of those phases of the tracks carried throughout the game, there are many possibilities and layers of how the tracks can go. So in the case of just putting certain phases in the soundtrack and lasting for a certain kinda short period of time doesn't really do all that much of a justice to those songs in my opinion. So I believe it's a bit more preferable to look at them in the context of the game itself. And by the way, if you haven't played this game already, just so you know, there are going to be spoilers contained over here as I talk about certain soundtracks that play in certain occasions throughout the game that basically carry throughout the entire story. Also, this is obviously just my opinion, and don't get into this video thinking that I'm going to do a full-on analysis on all of the songs and their meaning behind them. It's mostly just gonna be me being passionate about the soundtrack that I find to be pretty fascinating. So here's the tier list, starting from S tier being for the best of the best, going all the way down to the D tier, in which is gonna contain my least favorite songs out of the soundtrack. I don't really believe that there is any moment over here that I would consider to be an F tier, so this tier is not gonna be included over here. I don't really believe that there is any moment that I would say that I didn't like whatsoever. So starting off we have the track Significance, which is the main menu theme, and honestly I can't really say that it's one of the greatest main menu themes that I've heard of. I can't really say that it's one of the most memorable themes in the whole soundtrack. It's a bit of a subtle piano piece, it's certainly atmospheric and can be quite emotional, especially when you're getting more into the game. Like the first seconds hit you really hard as you go through the different endings and you also see the screens changing. There are certainly some intriguing elements about the overall sound and the production of this track, but it's kinda minimal and there's not really all that much about this one, so I can't really say it's all that impactful. In terms of main menu themes, I found others to be much more significant than this, so I'd put this one into a C tier. I believe that it's just a pretty decent main menu theme, but definitely not that much of a memorable one. Then we have City Ruins, Rays of Light. Now, this is one of the most important themes throughout this whole game. It plays into many different parts and I just loved in how many different phases this one went. I believe that this is the one that went into the most phases and having the most significant changes throughout it as well. Like at first when you hear this theme playing, it's this really kinda haunting ambient piece that has this really subtle elements about it, but it's quite mysterious and dark, and I really love the overall sound and the way it was structured. And then it elevates and just adds layers upon it, and the atmospheric elements would end up going away and have a bit of a more focus into some of its piano elements, and it just changes and elevates the whole experience. It makes it like a completely another thing, but it keeps its foundation. And then as you progress towards the game, it has this quite more bombastic feel, it gets more powerful and dynamic, and then you have the addition of the vocals, which are just spectacular. And one thing that I have to say about the overall soundtrack and something that I really like as a touch is that they've basically created an entire language specifically for the vocals of this soundtrack. And not only do I find this to be a pretty interesting touch, but I remember that when I was just a kid that when it comes to the vocals of songs that were of a foreign language to me, where I wouldn't know the lyrics, I would just sing them in sort of my own language based on how I would listen to the song, how I would listen to the vocals in my mind, and trying to recreate them and hum them in my own way. And the vocals of NieR Automata basically reminded me of this, because you don't really have to know the language, you can just simply perceive them in your mind as of how they sound and basically just try to perform them the way they sound like. And it also really helps that when it comes to the vocals, they're just incredible. The performances are solid, they've done an amazing job with the vocals over here, they sound amazing to the overall mix, and I just love how effective they are. The overall range, the melodies are instantly memorable. City Ruins is definitely one of the most striking examples. The vocals over here are phenomenal, and the overall mixing, the sound, the ranges, it's just excellent. I love the layers out of this track, how it basically goes into so many different moods, and how all of the phases throughout the moments it plays at the game always end up having a pretty significant role. Easily one of the most spectacular songs over here, and easily deserving of an S tier. Peaceful Sleep, this is the track that plays when you are at the resistance camp, and I believe it's a pretty fitting theme. It is somewhat melancholic, but it also feels like it's at a place of ease, like it feels kinda nice listening to this song. It's somewhat more cheerful in comparison at least to the more dreadful stuff that you listen throughout most of the soundtrack, which is mostly like really emotional and devastating. This one goes into a bit of a more different direction, is somewhat more catchy in a sense. I like the elements with it, with the instrumentation and the vocals. I believe that once again it's a song that is really beautifully mixed, and it's overall just a really beautiful song. In the context of the soundtrack version, there is a huge portion out of the song where it's basically just the music box version. And here's the thing, I believe that this track, when it comes to the soundtrack, I don't really believe that it's handled all that well. The pacing, the elements that they ended up putting in. But anyways, Peaceful Sleep, I think it's a pretty cool song. I really like it. I wouldn't really put it in an S tier though. I believe it's an A tier. I believe that it's a pretty fun song, and yeah, it's definitely a pretty memorable one. You would listen to it in many occurrences throughout the story. Memories of Dust, this is the theme that plays when you're in the desert map, and this one has a bit of a more Anatolian feel to it, or like with some sort of African instrumentation. There are lots of blends over here, but once again, I like the layers to this one because it has its more soothing moments, and then there are others where it gets really dynamic and really epic, and it has some excellent compositions to it when it comes to some of the string sections, to the more epic moments that sound amazing. And you have a different vocalist over here in comparison to the other tracks, City Ruins and Peaceful Sleep, which once again does an amazing job over here, beautiful range of vocals, an absolute phenomenal song that just gives me the chills. I really love the vocals in this one as well. They're mixed beautifully. And yeah, I'm just repeating myself after this point. Let's just give this another S tier. Birth of the Wish is one of the more epic tracks over here, going the most into this like direction of epic classical music, and it's another one that goes into a different direction when it comes to the vocals, as it goes into those more male and low operatic style, which once again it's handled amazingly over here. It's much more simplistic compared to the other songs when it comes to the vocals, but it's also another one that is easily effective, as it's quite easy to memorize, and I also love that the second time the chorus plays, it adds more layers of vocals to it and it becomes even more epic. Now this track plays in many different occurrences, and I like how in each one of the occurrences that this track plays, it kinda changes its ad-libs on certain occasions based on the theme it represents in every single of the occurrences throughout the story. It's little touches like this that I find them to be pretty interesting, and once again this is a theme that is handled amazingly. This is more of like a standard theme in its approaches it takes on epic classical music in comparison to the other tracks so far, which have felt to be much more exceptional in what they were trying to do, but still as like an epic theme, this is one of the best out there. This is handled in an amazing way, so this is another S tier. The Color of Depression. So there is just one occurrence where I remember this track playing, and it's after a certain side quest which had a bit of a disturbing twist to it, and so this soundtrack plays, which feels more of like an ambient horror theme, so it kinda makes sense to sort of create this disturbing attitude towards it, but outside of the atmosphere behind it, there is not really all that much about this track. It's nice for it setting the mood for this particular occasion, but outside of this moment, this is basically just a kinda forgettable moment, so there's not really that much to add over here. It's a bit lackluster, a bit minimal. It sets the tone for this particular moment and creating this more disturbing feel to it. Outside of that though, there is not really that much to it, so I'm gonna give it a D tier. And with that we go into the amusement park theme. Now I'd say that the very first time that I stepped into the amusement park was undoubtedly one of the greatest experiences I've had in gaming in general. There were quite a few moments throughout NieR Automata where my jaw just dropped. I believe that it contains some of the greatest sequences I've ever experienced in a video game. One of them was seeing this incredible attention of detail in the amusement park, and the thing that also elevated the experience a lot is this spectacular masterpiece of a song. I get it why for many people this is considered one of the greatest songs in the soundtrack. I can definitely say this. Like, this is just incredible. The overall pacing, how it's structured, the instrumentation having this sort of circus feel. I would never expect a song that would sound like this, ending up being so powerful, so dynamic, so beautiful, so epic. And the chorus, my god, this chorus is so addictive. Like for a couple of days, this chorus was just stuck in my head. Like I would hum those vocals for such a long period of time. Really hard for me to just imagine how you can come up with this so perfect. I would just simply, there would be occasions where I would just simply sit there in the amusement park just to enjoy the music, and also see this incredible amount of effort and detail they've put with the robots just dancing around and throwing confetti all over the place and just creating this incredible, lively, festive attitude. One of the top soundtracks in any game level. I love the amusement park. So many great memories out of this. Like, I'm gonna remember this forever. This is one of my most significant experiences in gaming. And yeah, obviously for me, this is an S tier and it's above anything else. This is top notch. a beautiful song. Another track that is pretty popular in the soundtrack. This is the one that plays when you fight Simon. It's a boss fight theme and it's a pretty epic one. It's another one that does an incredible job when it comes to its compositions, and it definitely contains some of the greatest vocal performances out of every song over here. And I like how you basically have both of the vocalists over here having their own parts. So yeah, for me, it is a really well executed song. Would I put it on an S tier though? No, I believe that it's a great song, I really like it and I get it why people like it so much, but for me it's more of like a high A tier. Voice of No Return is one of the more subtle themes throughout the game, which is a really nice song. It is quite beautiful and more of like the very emotional and heart-melting side of things. I like the guitar arrangements over here, the vocals also sound quite nice. It's a much more of a soothing song, which I believe it's executed pretty properly over here, and it does a really good job on how it makes you wanna feel. So for me, this is another one that is pretty significant in the soundtrack. I find it to be a pretty good moment and I would put it just above Peaceful Sleep over here, right in the middle in the A tier. Next is Grandma Destruction, another one of the more epic classical themes, and another one that just goes more into standard tropes like Birth of the Wish, but it's another one that in my opinion is executed amazingly. It's another one that plays in a few occasions throughout the soundtrack. I don't really believe it's played just once, and it's another one of those themes that in my opinion, when it comes to the more epic themes throughout this soundtrack, it's one of the more significant ones. Love the way it builds up, production once again is phenomenal, and the highlight for me would possibly be the string sections, which sound awesome over here. The way they rise up in a few of the occasions, it just sounds awesome. For me, I would put it in a low S tier. I wouldn't really say that it's like above those songs, but I still believe that it's an S tier. It's a track that was really memorable for me throughout the soundtrack, so yeah, I believe that it deserves an S tier. It was like really good. Faltering Prayer, Don't Breathe. I believe that this one is played in just one specific occasion when you complete the Robot Dojo side quest, which was definitely one of the most grinding, if not the most grinding side quest. Like, it took a while to really do anything that was required for this side quest, and I love how even the game acknowledges that this goes for way too long. For me, the way to do this particular quest was I basically finished it in the 9S playthrough. I believe that it becomes significantly easier as you can just hack your way through him and finishing it in a significantly much shorter period of time. And also at this point throughout the game you possibly have almost all of the materials required for all of the phases throughout the Robot Dojo side quest. And what was all of this side quest for? Basically just watching Robot Dojo die and just unlocking this soundtrack, which just plays once and that's about it. So I find it to be a really interesting way of how you can just really easily miss this particular piece of music, and how this is basically just set as your reward for completing a really lengthy side quest. So at the end of the day, was it worth it? Well, yes, I believe that this is a really beautiful piece. It's one of those that goes into the kind of more melancholic but also soothing side of things. It is a kind of depressive and sad song, honestly, and I like it. I believe that it does a pretty good job on what it does, and I'm just gonna give it an A tier. I'm just gonna give it a low A tier. I don't really believe that it's in that much of a significance in comparison to the other songs over here in the A tier. So yeah, I believe that it's fair to just put it in the bottom of the A tier. Then we have, here we go, Emil's song. Now this is the most unique moment over here in terms of its mood, because this is a much more of a cheerful and funny and novelty song. It's kinda interesting how Emil is treated as the comedic breath of fresh air in this like overall, really sad and depressing game, but even as you progress through Emil's side quest, you can see that there is a really tragic backstory behind it, and I believe that Emil is part of the first NieR game, which I haven't played it yet. I'm planning of playing Replicant, but yeah, considering that there is basically this kind of tragic backstory behind Emil, having him also being sort of the only comedic value throughout this whole game is a pretty interesting touch. Here's the thing, Emil's song is like a brass military song that detracts out of everything else the game has provided so far. It is like a novelty theme, and for what it does it nicely. You have some intentionally off-putting vocal deliveries, and just the overall instrumentation sounds kinda scuffed. The mixing and the instrumentation is still pretty nice though, but yeah, I don't know, it's kinda nice and a bit of a breath of fresh air to basically just have Emil going throughout the city ruins and have this silly and stupid soundtrack playing in the background. I believe it's a kinda nice touch, and I like how one of the main comedic values throughout this game has to do with the music. So yeah, Emil's song, it's pretty decent, but yeah, obviously not something really that much crazy about it. I'm gonna give it a B tier because it's still like a pretty enjoyable song. Treasure Times, I meant to write Treasure Times, there was a bit of a typo here, but anyways, this is another one of those moments that plays in like very little occasions if you complete certain side quests. And this is a really minimal song, but I just love how effective it is. Like, there is not really all that much to it, but I still really love it. It's one of those tracks that it plays in certain occasions throughout, the end of certain side quests, and it just works so well. It feels appropriate. It was one of those tracks that was quite emotional to me all of the times that it played. I believe the thing that helps the most is basically the vocals, which are just those of like a small child. And it's so adorable. Like, this is one of those, what's the word? It's a heart melting song. It makes my heart melt. It is so beautiful. It is so adorable. It is so cute. And it just makes me emotional just listening to such a cute and fun and silly song, which is also like so depressing considering everything that goes on with the story. So for me, Treasure Times is such a beautiful moment. I'm not really gonna give it an S tier because it's like a really minimal song, but I'm gonna give it a strong A tier. This was like a really beautiful moment for me throughout the game. Vague Hope Cold Rain. This is the one that plays throughout the end of the game when it comes to the endings A and B, in the moment where 2B has to kill 9S and she basically chokes him to death. There is also another moment where it plays throughout the ending C, throughout the final moments of 9S's death, and Vague Hope is a pretty effective song on being quite emotional in the moments that it plays. It's for some quite sad moments of the game. It basically somewhat follows a trope that I see with anime as well, where you basically have some sort of epic and emotional tracks with vocals included when you have a moment with lots of feels when a character is about to die. With that being said, another really good track in terms of its mixing, its production, its arrangements. I'm gonna give it an A tier. I believe that it works really nice in the places where it plays. I'm gonna put it right here. Then we have the ending credits theme for the ending A, which is Weight of the World, the English version. This is basically the one moment throughout the game so far where you basically have vocals in the English language. Kind of distracts with what the game was aiming to do with its main story, but I do get it why they decided to go into this direction with the ending credits theme, and we're gonna go back to it in some other occasions. I believe it's a really good track when it comes to like a credits theme. It is quite epic in its chorus, and once again, really good arrangements, structures. It is a really nice song. I'm gonna give it an A tier, and I'm gonna put it I'd say it's more memorable than Vague Hope and Voice of No Return. I believe that this is a quite appropriate setting, and I like the English version a lot. I believe that the vocals over here are really powerful and really good. Now we get, if we're talking about the physical version, we get into the second CD, and we have significance once again for some reason. I don't really get why this is the case, why they decided to do this. It happens with some other tracks over here as well as we go down the line, but I don't even remember having something all that different in this one. It's just the same pacing. I don't really believe that there is anything changing over here, but whatever, we have another city over here. We have City Ruins, the Shade version, which basically plays when we get in the third playthrough, where we play as A2 and 9S. And this is basically the moment where the story has gone into some pretty wild shit. It has become really dark, shit has gone downhill, and I believe that this theme, I wouldn't really say it's that much significant in comparison to what City Ruins Rays of Light did for me, but it was certainly a grower. I like the direction that it took. It was more of a string focused theme in comparison to Rays of Light, which was more of a piano focused. It feels somewhat more epic and dynamic, and it goes more into an Anatolian feel, and I believe that it's kind of fitting for the tone the game has created at this point. Another thing that I like about this song is that the words are different, the range and the delivery is basically the same, but they've used another set of words, and I like how they basically took the effort to put a different version over here. Even when it comes to the vocals, this is something that they could have easily skipped. They could have easily just used the same vocal pattern that they did with Rays of Light, but no, they actually did something a bit different here, and I like the commitment. I'd say that this is another S tier, as I'd say that it's another significant theme. However, I wouldn't really say that it was as significant in comparison to the Rays of Light and other moments over here. I would put it as the lowest of the S tiers so far. End of the Unknown is another one of the more different themes throughout this game, as it goes more into the electronic side of things. This is basically the theme of Adam and Eve when it comes to some of their boss fights, especially the ones with Adam. I'd say that this is a pretty interesting song, and I was certainly hoping for something like this throughout this soundtrack, as it goes into this really energetic electronic feel. It is a really nice electronic dance song with some really nice scenes. There is not really something all that amazing with its electronics and the sound choices, but I like how this one is different. I like how they decided to put something a bit different to the soundtrack, and I believe that this one worked pretty fine as a boss theme. I'm gonna put End of the Unknown in the A tier. I'm gonna put it here. We get another version of Voice of No Return here. Again, I don't really see the reason why. This one focuses more into the string sections rather than the vocals, but for me the vocals was definitely one of the most significant parts about this track. So this particular version of Voice of No Return, at least when it comes to the soundtrack over here, was not as impactful in my opinion. I'd still say that I like what it does, but I'm gonna put this version of Voice of No Return that we get through the soundtrack in the B tier. The theme of Pascal, which basically plays when you are at Pascal's village, has the same impact as Treasure Times for me. It is a track that is just really adorable, it's heart-melting, and it basically fits so well with the overall way they took the approach of Pascal's village. We also get once again those child vocals which are just so adorable. They just melt my heart, and it is such an emotional theme. And I knew I had this bad feeling that something bad was gonna happen at Pascal's village. I was in my mind, I would really see how they would end up making Pascal's village this really peaceful and beautiful place that at a certain point it was going to be destroyed. And it basically happened. And yeah, this track for me is actually one of the greatest. I really loved Pascal's theme. I absolutely adore this track. I'm gonna give it an S tier. I believe it's that much of a great song. I really love this song. Forest Kingdom, this basically plays at the Forest Kingdom, and this one took me quite a few listens to appreciate in comparison to others. This was certainly a grower. It took me a while to really appreciate and really like the directions out of this one. What's interesting about this is the vocal directions, as it gives me a vibe of, and I might be completely off to this, but it kind of reminds me of like some of the vocal directions of Inuit vocalists. But yeah, Forest Kingdom is a pretty interesting song. It takes some interesting directions with its vocals and also with instrumentation. It's another track that sounds awesome, and I'm gonna give it a sort of low A tier. I'm gonna put it like over here. Dark Colossus Kaiju is a theme that plays when you're at a flooded city and you fight this huge machine that emerges from the bottom of the ocean. Is this giant, intimidating robot. And this track goes into this more epic classical theme, but I wouldn't really say it's one of the most memorable ones. I'd say that this was, even I remember when I was playing the game, that when this track was playing, I remember saying to myself, yeah, this was not that much of a memorable song. The thing is that during this boss fight there was a lot going on. It was a quite busy fight because it was focusing more into the mechanics of a bullet hell, which is one of the directions that the game goes in actually multiple occasions. And there was also a lot of dialogue going on, so there were lots of things that would basically distract you from the soundtrack. In comparison, I believe that this one feels like a more basic moment without that much to offer. I like the moment where we get this transition to this church organ solo. I believe that this was a nice transition from the really epic theme that was going on, but yeah, definitely not one of the most memorable tracks over here. I believe it's a fine theme, but I'm just gonna give it like a high B tier at the end of the day. Copied City, now this is a really interesting track. It basically plays once, just when you are in the Copied City, which is this really mysterious place, and it fits that this track also sounds quite mysterious with its overall tone, its dark atmosphere, it's kinda haunting, and I just really like the piano sections over here, the strings that just sound kinda terrifying. And actually, for me, this is a really great soundtrack. Even though it plays in just one moment throughout the story, it managed to be really impactful. Like the moment I stepped on this place and this track started playing, I instantly fell in love with it. So for me, it's actually one of the most memorable moments over here, and I'm gonna give it an S tier. I'm gonna give it a kind of a low S tier. I believe that this is an excellent song. Rest Weaponry. Now, this is a pretty interesting one, as at the very first occurrences that I've ended up listening to this song, it was just those really subtle moments where you would get it when you would return back to the factory just to make some side quests. And I couldn't really pick up what was with the song, as it was so buried away in the background. But this track would just keep on coming and coming later down the line, and also in some pretty significant moments throughout the story, and it would just end up clicking on me and just becoming much better the more I would listen to it. I like how this track basically started with this kind of mysterious feel, as of like being quite curious what's going on with it, where does it try to go, and then just ended up feeling like one of the most significant moments throughout this whole game. Like there were some moments where this track was hitting really hard, being really emotional, and I believe that it mainly started when it would introduce the vocal patterns, which would sound awesome over here. I would actually say that it contains some of the greatest vocal structures and ranges throughout this whole soundtrack. Rest Weaponry is a hidden gem. It's one of those tracks that just takes a while for you to really appreciate it, but when it hits really hard. So I'm gonna put it in an S tier right here after Copied City and before Pascal. Possessed by Disease. This was certainly not one of my favorites. Now this one goes into a bit of a similar direction with Forest Kingdom, with the delivery of the vocals, and also the instrumentation is kind of similar, the structure, the directions that it goes. It sounds like a bit of a more epic and dynamic version of this song in certain occasions, but I kinda appreciated more the more subtle elements of Forest Kingdom. Possessed by Disease was not one of the tracks that I remember that much out of the soundtrack. So yeah, I'm just gonna give it a C tier, but yeah, below significance. I believe that this was not that much of a strong song throughout the soundtrack. Broken Heart is another occasion, like I don't really remember in which occasions I've ever heard Broken Heart. Like I returned to it to the soundtrack and I was like, I don't really remember all that much about this track. It's kind of a chill song, but I would also say that it was somewhat lackluster and not necessarily having something all that minimal that even managed to be effective. So yeah, for me Broken Heart was just a pretty okay theme, but not something that I remember. I'm gonna give it a D tier. Here we have another version of Red's Weaponry, which is basically just a short segment and a phase of what you would basically get if you would listen to Red's Weaponry unlike the game. I believe that this version over here also contains a few passages of like dark ambience in some of the occasions with some of the sound effects that would come into place, so it would create this more of like a horror-esque theme to it, which was certainly fitting with some of the themes and directions that it could go when you would play the game, but still this one doesn't really add all that much. I like it, I still believe that it's a great moment throughout the soundtrack, but yeah, I'm just gonna give it like a low A tier, like over here. That was like a really heavy song. Another one that I remember just playing in two certain occasions, yeah, I believe it was just two occasions where you would end two side quests, and one of them was like really heavy, and when this track played I was like, god damn, like that was like really devastating. This is certainly one of the most devastating moments over here. Kinda minimal song as it focuses the most on like those operatic vocals, and then as it progresses you also have those string sections that sound really powerful and quite dynamic, and it's a really impactful song. It's extremely emotional and I believe that it's executed amazingly. The overall structure, the mixing, the production is once again excellent over here. One of the more minimal songs that manages to be extremely effective on what it does. And at the moments it plays, it's just like really powerful. One of the most powerful moments over here. So I'm gonna give it an S tier and I'm gonna go above Coppet City over here. Dependent Weakling is one of the more epic themes throughout the soundtrack, and also one of those that I would say it goes into a few more basic directions. Some of those that I was somewhat worried getting into the game that this is basically just how the whole soundtrack was gonna sound like. Obviously I was really wrong about that, but still there are a few pretty decent and interesting elements about this track, but I believe that so far, out of everything we've heard this type of sound executed much better in other occasions. Once again though, the sound is really rich over here, there is an amazing balance between all of the instruments, and there are some moments that I like a lot, but it's definitely not one of those that I remember, so I'm gonna give it like a B tier. Then we get the ending credits theme out of ending B. This is the Japanese version where we basically have the Japanese vocals. I don't really believe that this version works that much amazingly in comparison to the English version. I don't really find the vocal deliveries over here to be that much more significant, but it's still a pretty nice moment. It's still a really nice direction to this ending. So yeah, there is not really that much more to say because there is not really that much changing with this track. I'm gonna give it like a low A tier, like the lowest of 8 tiers so far, right over here. Rebirth and Hope, this is basically just a really short track. I believe that it goes for like less than 1 minute. It's this moment right at the end of the game, at the ending say at B, where it's basically a little bit after 2B kills 9S, and there's this theme playing, which I find it to be really beautiful. Obviously there's not a lot to it because it's like a really short moment, but I honestly like that they included this. I was like, it would be a bummer if it was not included, because honestly this is quite nice and I like that they ended up including this. I'm gonna give it a low A tier because I mean there's not like a lot to it, but I still found this to be a really cool moment throughout the soundtrack, so I really like that they included this over here. War and War, it's at this point where we basically have a track that shares elements of like other moments throughout the soundtrack in terms of like its structure and its melodies, but it's done in a different direction in a much more epic way. I'd say it's a good theme, but it's not one of those that ended up resonating that much with me. I'd say that this is a cool song, but it's at this point where I believe that the game has proven that it can do much better than just what we get over here. So War and War is gonna go to the B tier because I believe that it's just a really cool song, but that's basically most about it. I'm gonna go over here. No, I basically put it at the top of B tier. I believe that there are some really nice and interesting elements over here. Crumbling Lies Front. I don't really remember much about this track. This is one of those moments where I believe like, especially if you're listening to like the soundtrack and like Spotify or like the physical version, it's at this point where it seems like it would be hard to say that it runs out of ideas, but it's at this point where there's not really that much more to like this point of the soundtrack. This is like a theme that basically shares elements out of other moments that are basically executed much better. I'd say that this is basically the case with Crumbling Lies Front. I didn't really think that much out of this track, so I'm just gonna give it a D tier. I'd say that it's an okay theme, but there's not really that much to it. Widespread Illness is more of a soothing theme. It is kind of an emotional one, but one that also goes into this more mysterious side of things. It is somewhat terrifying with some of the directions that it goes, with those heavy piano keys that feel like they're being played all together. It has this really dramatic feel to it, and I believe it's a cool song. I can't necessarily say that it's one of my favorites, but I'd say that it played a kind of a big role in the moments that it played throughout the game. It was certainly pretty memorable for what it was trying to do. So for me, Widespread Illness is like a low A tier. Fortress of Lies, here we go. This is basically one of the first themes that you would listen while playing this game. This is the one that plays throughout the bunker. And I believe that this sets the tone for the bunker amazingly, as it's this basically safe place where you can save your game and you're like with all of your fellow androids. So it has this soothing feel to it. It creates this safe environment. And I also like the more futuristic approach throughout this whole thing, as it kind of fits with, you know, the bunker being into space and just basically feeling quite spacey. It is a quite aesthetically pleasing song, and for me, actually one of the most important tracks throughout this whole soundtrack. I really loved Fortress of Lies, and I'm gonna give it like, I'm gonna put it over here, over Morning and below Rest Weaponry. Fortress of Lies was an amazing track. We get this version of Veg Hope, Spring Rain, which I don't really remember being played in any section throughout the game. Maybe it's in like an optional sequence that I haven't played, but the thing is that I prefer much more the Cold Rain version. The Spring Rain one goes into some directions that I don't really believe are all that much fitting with this particular song, so I like that they basically just focused more on like vague hope cold rain and not like the spring rain version. It's decent, but I'm just gonna give it like a low B. Song of the Ancients. Now, the interesting thing with Song of the Ancients is that for me, this track actually works better as an instrumental. I think that the vocals are fine, but for me, this is the only case where I can think of a song that was more impactful to me as an instrumental, as I really liked what it did with some of the directions with instrumentation, some really good balances throughout all of the instruments, a pretty epic song that plays in quite a few occasions throughout the game. I quite like it as a song, but I would like put it in like a kinda low A tier. I'm gonna put it like right here above like the second version of Red's Weaponry. Blissful Death was certainly one of the heaviest tracks over here. This is another pretty subtle and quite minimal moment that mostly focuses on piano. You have some very little vocal inflections here and there, and you also have those moments where it feels like the piano is playing in reverse, so it creates this kind of haunting aesthetic to it. In the occasions that it plays, it's pretty impactful. It is, like I said, a pretty heavy and emotional theme, and I really like it. I like the directions that they took with this one, being quite minimal and quite effective with its instrumentation, and I like the touch of the reverse piano moments. Everything in reverse just sounds horrifying. So yeah, Blissful Death for me is like an A tier. I'm gonna put it over here above Song of the Ascents. Emile Despair. Now I don't believe that I've heard of this track in the game, because I believe that it's in this section where you have the boss fight of Emile, in which I haven't really gone through that point yet. I've basically just got into the secret passage of Emile's house where I stole the mask, and then Emile attacks you and he's just really overpowered. He's level 99 and I haven't gotten past that point. But listening to the track, it feels like a really epic and powerful boss theme. Maybe it would resonate with me more if I actually play the boss fight, but what it stands for, I believe that it's just quite decent. I'm gonna give it like a high B, because I remember like really liking the track from what I've heard of it outside of the context of the game. Faltering Prayer Starry Sky is a version that I don't really get why it exists. I don't really remember listening to it in the game, like in any part. This felt kinda pointless. Now, I really liked the Faltering Prayer Down Breeze song, but this version over here, which is more of like a music box version, feels quite lackluster. There's not really that much going on to it. I'm just gonna give it a D tier, as I don't really remember that much out of it. It was definitely not that much of a significant song. I'm gonna give it like at the bottom of the D tier. Alien Manifestation, which is Alien Manifestation over here because it cut the end. Anyways, this is basically the very first track that you hear when you play the game, and you actually hear it in other occasions throughout the game as well, and I'm really glad that you do, because this gave me a really good starting impression when it comes to the soundtrack. Like, I've listened to this and I was like, okay, I can definitely see why people really like the soundtrack, because this was a really nice way to kick things off. A really badass theme, really dynamic, instantly saw the great production behind this one, the great balance of sounds. I'd say that the vocals feel a little bit distracting in this particular one. Definitely not my favorites, but it's not like I didn't like them. This is certainly one of the top songs for me. This is an easy S tier and like a quite high S tier. That track for me was phenomenal in every moment it played. I really liked fighting when this one was playing. Next up is The Tower. Now, this is a pretty interesting one, as this one goes into somewhat a bit of a different direction in comparison to most of the soundtrack over here. There is something quite weird about the scenes over here and some of the approaches with the ambience, as it's kinda trippy, kinda spacey, and weirdly enough it sounds almost euphoric. It is a kind of a weird approach, especially considering that we're talking about a segment with the tower being towards the end of the game, where everything has gone downhill and it has become this really devastating experience. So I believe it's a bit of an interesting choice to have this type of track this point throughout the game. It is also one of the more electronic pieces, and it gives the most of like a touch to this more 8-bit approach that occurs with the hacking sections throughout NieR's playthrough and the third playthrough. And I liked listening to many of the 8-bit versions out of the tracks over here, but the tower ended up adding more elements into those particular sections, which were a lot, especially in the tower. So I believe that there are some pretty interesting elements with this song. I can't really say it's one of my favorites, but I kinda find it a bit of a significant song, mainly due to its position throughout the game. I'm gonna put it right here. Bipolar Nightmare is one of the more epic classical themes throughout the game, and I don't really believe that there is that much of a need to add that much more. It just does a really nice job on what it does. We've heard other tracks go into similar directions, this one just happens to be one of the best ones. I'm just sounding more of like a broken record right now. I don't have that many things to add. I just know that Bipolar Nightmare is a track that plays into many different occasions throughout the game, and it just sounds awesome. It is a really nice, really dynamic and really powerful track. I'm gonna put it over here. The Sound of the End, this is the track that mostly plays throughout the final sequences, which were very sad and emotional. It was at this point where the game was just going downhill, there was just so much going on, and this track was just perfect for the occasion. And the other interesting thing is that it basically started playing right after the theme of the tower, so it's nice to see how they ended up going into such different directions. The thing about The Sound of the End is that it's actually a really epic theme, but it's not that much fast-paced, it's not that much energetic. It's actually really slow and dreadful. The operatic vocals make it even more impactful, and so this ended up being a really powerful theme. It also has those ambient sections that sound incredible as well. Many different layers throughout the song. It is an amazing song, and I'm gonna give it a pretty high A tier right here. Yeah, this was a really great song. Then we have Weight of the World, the French version, which was at the endings C and D. And this was the least memorable for me. It didn't really do that much for me. It's another nice direction, I like this version as well, but it's not the one that I remember the most. I'm gonna give it like a high B over here. But then we get the final credits with the ending E, the end of Yorha. And this is where the final credits elevate in their greatest form. This one starts with an 8-bit version of a song, then the rest is more of like the same, blending the English version with the French version, with the Japanese version, and finally when you have the sequence where it feels like it's impossible to beat, but then you got the help of random players throughout the world, and then with the power of friendship, you have those choirs start playing. This is when this track becomes a masterpiece, and this is where it basically gives me shivers every single time. It becomes this really emotional track that manages, even as a credits theme, to create such an impact in which I've rarely seen other credit songs managing to do. This is the perfect way of ending the game, with a theme that is as strong and as powerful as this, and this final version deserves an S tier rating. And so this is it. This is my tier list with NieR Automata soundtrack, which is for me a phenomenal soundtrack. And if you haven't played the game already, I highly suggest you to do so. I hope you liked this tier list video. This is definitely something quite different in comparison to what I was doing previously, but I was planning to do something like this for quite a long time, and now I basically just saw the opportunity. Leave a like if you enjoyed the video, subscribe for more content like this, and I'll see you all in the next video. Goodbye.